A millionaire returns exhausted to his mansion, ready to follow his usual routine, going straight up to the second-floor bedroom. Suddenly, an 8-year-old girl in torn clothes emerges from the shadows near the stairs and whispers words that make his blood run cold. "Uncle, don't go up. They're waiting for you upstairs." Before he can process the shock of finding a strange child inside his supposedly safe home, a deafening bang echoes from upstairs. What happens next is terrifying. The torrential rain lashed against the windows of the imposing mansion like desperate fingers trying to break the glass. Edward Sterling dragged his feet across the entrance hall, each step echoing on the polished marble like a solitary lament. His back was stooped under the weight of another devastating day of meetings that had sealed the fate of hundreds of employees. His loosened tie hung from his neck like a noose, and his eyes, once piercing, now reflected only the emptiness of a man who had lost his soul in merciless negotiations. The silence of the house enveloped him like a cold embrace. Not even the staff remained after 9 p.m., a demand of his to preserve the privacy he so cherished. Edward sighed deeply, inhaling the scent of floor polish and loneliness that permeated every room of his empty palace. His hands trembled slightly as he placed the Italian leather briefcase on the hall's mahogany table, a tremor he attributed to exhaustion, but which his 62 years whispered was something deeper. The routine called to him as always. Climb the Carrara marble staircase, change from his suit into comfortable clothes, descend for a solitary dinner prepared by the housekeeper before her departure. A predictable existence that soothed him after days, filled with decisions that destroyed lives with the cold precision of a surgeon's scalpel. Edward placed his foot on the first step of the staircase when a small shadow moved near its base. His muscles tensed instantly. The most sophisticated security system in the county protected this estate. Cameras, sensors, silent alarms connected directly to the monitoring company. It was impossible for anyone to have penetrated his defenses. Edward blinked several times, convinced that exhaustion was playing tricks on his mind. But then she emerged from the shadows, a girl of about 8, with matted brown hair stuck to her face by the damp. Her clothes, a floral dress that had once been pretty and a frayed cardigan, were torn and filthy. Her dark brown eyes shone with a disconcerting mixture of terror and determination. She was real. Utterly, impossibly, and terrifyingly real. Inside his supposedly impenetrable fortress, the girl placed a small, dirty finger to her lips, making the universal gesture for silence. Edward felt his heart hammer, pumping ice through veins that seemed to have forgotten how to function. She approached with careful steps, like a wild animal nearing a known trap. "Mister," she whispered, her voice barely louder than a falling. "Leaf, don't go up. They're waiting for you." The words hit Edward like gut punches. His world, built on absolute control and impenetrable security, crumbled in a single sentence. He opened his mouth to question, to demand an explanation, to retake control of a situation that was spiraling completely beyond his comprehension. But before any sound could emerge from his dry throat, a deafening crash exploded from the floor above. Wood splintering, furniture being overturned, men's voices barking orders in a clipped jargon Edward didn't understand, but whose violent tone needed no translation. They really were up there, waiting for him. The girl grabbed his hand with a strength surprising for someone so small. Her ice-cold fingers intertwined with his, conveying an urgency that words could not express. "We have to go. Now," she muttered, pulling him toward the back of the house. Edward glanced one last time at the staircase leading up to his bedroom, where unknown criminals awaited his arrival with intentions his mind refused to fully process. Then he looked at the mysterious child who had materialized from nowhere to save his life. Who was she? How had she gotten in? And more importantly, why had she chosen to warn him instead of simply escaping? As she guided him through the shadows towards safety, Edward understood that his life had just taken a completely unexpected turn. Nothing would be predictable or controllable anymore. And maybe, for the first time in decades, that wasn't necessarily a tragedy. The girl led Edward through the dark corridors of the mansion with a familiarity that deeply unsettled him. Her every step was calculated, avoiding the creaky floorboards, skirting the antique furniture without hesitation. How did she know his home better than many of his own staff? Edward's heart hammered against his ribs as more crashes echoed from upstairs, now accompanied by harsh voices arguing about where he could be. "This way," the girl whispered, pulling him toward the kitchen. Her small hands were cold, but they conveyed an iron will that contrasted sharply with her frail appearance. Edward let himself be led, his mind still struggling to process the impossible reality of the situation. In 62 years of building a corporate empire through calculated decisions and absolute control, he had never been so completely dependent on another person, let alone an unknown child. The kitchen was shrouded in shadows, with only the intermittent flashes of lightning from outside creating ghostly silhouettes of the stainless steel appliances. The girl released his hand for a moment to cautiously open the door leading to the back garden. The rain immediately invaded the space, bringing gusts of cold wind that made Edward shiver. "Are you sure?" he murmured, looking out at the storm. The girl nodded vigorously, her eyes shining with a disquieting seriousness. "For one so young, they won't look for us in the rain. At least not right away," she replied, with a wisdom that seemed far beyond her years. "And I know a safe place." Edward hesitated for only a second before following her into the tempestuous night. The rain hit them like a liquid wall, soaking their clothes in seconds. He lost his Italian loafers in the garden mud, but the girl pressed on with unwavering determination, guiding him through a maze of ornamental shrubs and trees that he had paid a fortune for landscapers to create, but had never truly explored. As they moved, Edward tried to organize his thoughts amidst the chaos. Who were those men in his house? How had they breached his security system? And above all, who was this extraordinary child who had appeared at the exact moment to save him? Each question spawned three more, creating a web of mysteries his analytical mind was desperate to unravel. Here, the girl finally stopped near the back wall of the property. Edward looked around, seeing only ivy-covered stone and a small iron gate he didn't recall ever seeing before. With nimble movements, she manipulated a seemingly solid section of the wall, revealing a narrow opening, just wide enough for a thin person to pass through. "How did you—" Edward began, but she was already squeezing through the passage. He followed with difficulty, his suit tearing on the rough stone, and emerged on the other side into a narrow alley that smelled of garbage and urban loneliness. The girl was waiting for him patiently, the rain running down her small face like tears. "Now, we need to get away from the house," she said simply. "They'll realize you didn't go upstairs, and they'll start looking." Edward nodded, still trying to process the surreal turn his life had taken in less than 15 minutes. An hour ago, his biggest concern was choosing between salmon or lamb for dinner. Now he was fleeing from unknown criminals, led by a mysterious girl through deserted streets in the dead of night. As they walked in silence through the dark streets, a burning question finally escaped his lips. "Why did you save me?" The girl stopped abruptly, turning to face him with eyes that seemed to carry the weight of experiences far beyond her age. "Because," she said slowly, "even bad people deserve a second chance." Her words hit Edward like a lightning strike, leaving him breathless. How did she know about his questionable decisions? about the lives he had destroyed in the name of profit. Who exactly was this child, and what else did she know about him? The girl led Edward through deserted streets for nearly an hour, her bare feet navigating with precision between puddles and urban debris. He followed in silence, his mind churning with questions he didn't dare to verbalize. Each step took him further from his comfort zone, the controlled world of corporate meetings and calculated decisions, and plunged him deeper into an unknown territory where an 8-year-old girl seemed to have all the answers. Finally, she stopped in front of an abandoned warehouse downtown. The windows were boarded up, and colorful graffiti covered the walls like urban scars. Edward hesitated, his self-preservation instinct screaming alarms, but the girl was already climbing the entrance steps with the confidence of someone who knew every stone on the path. "It's safe here," she said simply, pushing open a door that should have been locked but swung open easily. "Nobody comes here at night." The interior smelled of mildew and neglect, but was surprisingly neat. Edward noticed small signs of habitation, a folded blanket in a corner, a few cans of food stacked tidily, a small portable stove. His throat tightened as he realized that this child had turned this desolate place into her home. "You live here?" he asked, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't quite identify. The girl nodded casually, as if living in an abandoned building were the most natural thing in the world. "For 4 months, ever since." She hesitated, biting her lower lip. "Ever since my dad lost his job and my mum got sick." A knot formed in Edward's stomach. "And your parents? Where are they now?" "Dad's trying to find work in other cities. Mum's in the county hospital, but they said they can't do any more for her without money for the expensive medication." Her words came out without self-pity, only the grim resignation of someone who had learned too early that the world could be cruel. Edward's hands trembled as he absorbed this information. How many families had he torn apart with his mass layoffs? How many children like this one had been thrown onto the streets because of his ruthless business decisions? Guilt washed over him like a cold wave, making him sit down heavily on an old crate. "How did you know about the men at my house?" he finally managed to ask. The girl crouched beside him, her eyes gleaming in the gloom, filtering through the boarded-up windows. "I saw them yesterday afternoon. They were watching your house, taking notes, talking about schedules. They seemed dangerous. And why did you decide to warn me? You don't even know me." A sad smile crossed the girl's small face. "I know who you are, Mr. Edward Sterling. My dad used to talk about you sometimes." Edward tensed, bracing for accusations and resentment. But she continued, "He said you were a very smart man, but you'd forgotten how to be kind. He said people like that aren't evil, just lost." Tears that Edward hadn't shed in decades began to burn in his eyes. "Your father, what was his name?" "Robert Miller. He worked in the accounting department at your company. He was let go when he found some irregularities in the books." She paused, studying Edward's face. "But he never spoke ill of you. He said that maybe one day you'd realize there are more important things than money." Edward vaguely remembered Robert Miller, a conscientious accountant who had been eliminated during a necessary restructuring 2 years ago. At the time, he had been just another name on a list of budget cuts. Now, looking into his daughter's brave eyes, Robert gained a face, a history, a humanity. "Why did you risk your safety to save me?" he insisted, needing to understand. The girl tilted her head as if the answer were obvious. "Because Dad taught me that even when people do wrong things, there's still good inside them. And because—" She hesitated, then whispered, "I didn't want another family to lose someone." Edward's heart broke and reformed all at once. In that moment, he knew his life had changed forever. But there were still dangerous men looking for him, and secrets left to uncover. Dawn brought a grey light that filtered through the cracks in the boarded-up windows, better revealing the girl's makeshift refuge. Edward had spent the night on watch, observing her as she slept curled up in the thin blanket, her gentle breathing a stark contrast to the storm of thoughts raging in his mind. Every distant rumble of traffic, every noise from the street, made him tense, wondering if it was the men who had invaded his house. "Good morning, Mr. Sterling." Her soft voice pulled him from his reverie. The girl had woken and was watching him with curious eyes. "You didn't sleep at all, did you?" "I couldn't," he admitted, massaging his temples where a throbbing headache had taken root. "I need to know more about what you saw. How many men were there? Did you hear any names?" The girl sat up, hugging her knees to her chest, a defensive gesture that made Edward realize how blunt he was being. "I'm sorry," he said more gently. "I don't even know your name yet." "Sophia," she replied with a shy smile. "Sophia Miller." "Sophia," Edward repeated, savoring the name. "A beautiful name. Can you tell me what you saw yesterday?" Sophia nodded, her expression turning serious. There were 3 of them. They came in a big black SUV, the kind you see in the movies. They parked across the street for a long time, and one of them kept watching your house with small binoculars. Edward leaned forward, absorbing every detail. "What kind of clothes were they wearing? Did they look like cops?" "No, not cops." Sophia shook her head emphatically. "They wore dark clothes, but not uniforms, and—" She hesitated, biting her lip. "They swore. A lot. Cops wouldn't talk like that, right?" "Probably not," Edward agreed, though he knew a few who definitely would. "Did you manage to hear what they were talking about?" Sophia closed her eyes, concentrating on the memory. "They said you always come home at 9 o'clock, that you always go straight up to your room, and that—" She paused, looking uncomfortable. "That it would be easy because you live alone and send all the staff home early." Edward's blood ran cold. They didn't just know his routine, they knew the intimate details of his domestic habits that required either prolonged surveillance or an inside source. "Anything else?" "One of them complained he was tired of waiting, said they wanted to get Project Sterling over with." Sophia opened her eyes, meeting Edward's worried gaze. "What's Project Sterling?" Edward swallowed hard. A project bearing his name indicated detailed professional planning. These weren't common criminals looking for an opportunistic score. They were professional killers with a specific target. "I don't know," he lied, not wanting to frighten her further, but Sophia seemed to see through it. "They wanted to hurt you, didn't they? That's why I had to warn you. Why didn't you just run when you saw them? Why risk coming into my house?" Sophia fiddled with the torn hem of her dress. "Because I remembered what Dad always said, that when you see someone in danger, you have to help, even if that person has hurt you before." "I hurt you." Edward felt his heart clench. "You fired Dad when he tried to tell you about the wrong numbers in the company books. Mom said that's why we lost the house and she got sick with worry." There was no resentment in her voice, only sadness. "But Dad said maybe you didn't know that would happen to us." Edward closed his eyes, vaguely recalling the meeting where he'd approved Robert Miller's termination. The man had insisted on talking about accounting irregularities, but Edward had been too busy with a major merger to pay proper attention. He had simply signed the dismissal authorization his vice president had placed on his desk. "Sophia," he said slowly, "was your father right about the numbers? Was there really something wrong?" She nodded vigorously. "Dad saved all the spreadsheets. He said one day the truth would have to come out." Edward felt a spark of hope and terror simultaneously. If Robert had documented irregularities, it might explain why someone wanted him eliminated, not for revenge, but to cover up a crime. Where are those documents now? Hidden at home. At least they were. Sophia paused, worry clouding her eyes. Mr. Sterling, what if they find out about Dad? What if they go after him too? The question hit Edward like a fist. He had assumed he was the only target, but if there was a larger conspiracy involving the company, the entire Miller family could be in danger. And now Sophia was with him, an innocent child dragged into a deadly situation. Edward spent the morning pacing the small confines of their hideout, his corporate brain finally kicking into gear after the initial shock. He needed information, resources, a plan, but every strategy he formulated crashed against a devastating reality. He didn't know who he could trust. If there was a conspiracy at his company large enough to warrant his assassination, how many of his own executives were involved? Sophia, he called, interrupting the girl who was quietly playing with some scraps of colored paper she had found. I need to make some calls, but I can't use my cell. They could be tracking it. She pointed to a payphone across the street, visible through a crack in a boarded-up window. That one still works. I use it sometimes to call the hospital and ask about Mom. Edward nodded, checking his pockets for change. He found only credit cards and $100 bill, the instruments of a privileged world that seemed useless. Now, Sophia saw his predicament and smiled, producing a handful of quarters from some secret pocket in her torn dress. You can use these, she offered generously. Sophia, that's your money. You need... Dad always said money is only good for something when it helps other people. She cut in with the simple wisdom of a child who had learned lessons that millionaire executives took decades to grasp. Edward walked down to the pay phone, the quarters weighing in his hand like tiny treasures. His first call was to Marcus, his CFO of 15 years, and the person he trusted most at the company. The phone rang several times before a sleepy voice answered. Marcus, it's Edward. I need you to meet me, urgently. Edward? Man, it's 8 a.m. on a Saturday. And why are you calling from a strange number? It's complicated. Can you meet me at the Central Diner in an hour? And Marcus, don't tell anyone about this call. There was a suspicious pause. All right, but you're worrying me. Did something happen? Edward hesitated. The concern in Marcus's voice sounded genuine, but after last night his paranoia was on high alert. I'll explain when I see you. Back in the abandoned warehouse, he found Sophia packing her few belongings into a small pink backpack. Where are you going? He asked, feeling an unexpected pang of panic. I'm going with you, she replied simply. It's not safe for us to be apart now. Edward started to protest, but realized she was right. If they found out about Robert Miller and his family, Sophia would be a target too. Besides, in less than 24 hours, this extraordinary girl had become his only trusted ally in a world that suddenly seemed filled with enemies. The Central Diner was a modest downtown establishment, the kind of place Edward would never normally set foot in. He chose a booth in the back, watching as Sophia ordered a hot chocolate at the counter with the self-possession of someone used to taking care of herself. She returned, carrying 2 mugs. She had ordered a coffee. For him, without being asked. Thank you, he murmured, touched by the gesture. Marcus arrived on time, but something in his posture made Edward tense. His CFO looked nervous, his eyes scanning the diner as if looking for someone. When he finally spotted Edward, his expression was one of relief, but also guilt. Edward, what a relief to see you. When I heard your house was broken into... You heard? Edward leaned forward. How? Marcus swallowed hard. The security company called me when the alarms went off and they couldn't reach you. I went over there with the police this morning. And did they find anything? They did. Marcus lowered his voice. Edward, these weren't common burglars. Professional gear, listening devices, blueprints of the house. Someone planned this meticulously. Edward watched Marcus's face carefully. It was too much information, delivered too quickly. "How did you get all those details? The police don't usually share evidence." A flush crept up Marcus's cheeks. "I have a few contacts in the department. I thought you'd want to know." "Marcus," Edward said slowly, "do you happen to know anything about irregularities in the company's books?" His CFO's face went pale. His hands trembled slightly before he hid them under the table. "Why are you asking that?" Edward had his answer. 15 years of trust evaporated in a second. Sophia, who had been quietly playing with the straw in her hot chocolate, looked up and met Edward's gaze. A silent understanding passed between them. Once again, it was time to run. Edward rose slowly from the table, each movement calculated to seem casual. Sophia understood immediately, grabbing her backpack with equally natural movements. Marcus was still talking nervously about the details of the break-in, but his words sounded distant and meaningless to Edward, who now saw his CFO through a completely different lens. "Marcus," he interrupted gently, "I need to use the restroom. Sophia, come with me." The girl nodded, sliding from her seat with the silent agility Edward had come to admire. Marcus looked confused by the request, but waved distractedly, his eyes darting nervously back toward the diner's entrance. In the narrow hallway leading to the restrooms, Edward whispered quickly, "Is there a back way out?" Sophia pointed to a door marked "Employees Only" at the end of the hall. "Through there. It leads to the alley." They slipped through the door, emerging into a foul-smelling alley crammed with dumpsters. Edward's heart hammered as he led Sophia away from the diner, expecting at any moment to hear Marcus shouting or footsteps running after them. But only urban silence followed as they moved away down the side streets. "He was lying," Sophia said after they'd walked several blocks. "It wasn't a question." "How did you know?" "Dad taught me to watch people. When Marcus was talking about knowing cops, his eyes looked up and to the left. Dad said that usually means someone is making something up." Edward looked at the girl with growing admiration. In her 8 years, she had developed observational skills that many executives took decades to learn. "You're very smart, Sophia." She shrugged, as if intelligence were a natural, unimportant thing. "Where do we go now?" Edward stopped in the middle of the sidewalk, the reality of his situation finally crystallizing. He couldn't go home. He couldn't trust his employees. His credit cards were likely being monitored. And he had only an 8-year-old girl as an ally in a conspiracy that clearly involved powerful people. "I need to find out who's behind this," he muttered, more to himself than to Sophia. "And I need to find the documents your father hid." "The house was sold after Dad was let go," Sophia said sadly. "But before we left, he hid the important papers in a safe place." "Where?" Sophia bit her lip, seeming to hesitate. "Promise you won't be mad." "I promise." "He hid them at your company, in his old office. He said if anyone wanted to find evidence against the company, they'd never look for it inside the company itself." Edward blinked several times, processing the irony. Robert Miller had hidden potentially incriminating documents at the scene of the crime. But how? The office was cleared out when he left. Dad knew every corner of that building. He worked there for 12 years. Sophia smiled, for the first time since they'd left the diner. He said there was a place not even the cleaning crew went, behind a false wall in the basement near the machine room. Edward knew the basement of his company as well as he knew his own home. He had personally overseen the building's renovation. 5 years ago, he didn't remember any false wall, but Robert Miller was the kind of meticulous employee who would notice details others overlooked. "Sophia, getting into the building will be extremely dangerous. If Marcus is in on this, he's probably alerted everyone about our talk at the diner." So we need to go in when no one is expecting it, she answered logically, like last night, when no one imagined I'd be in your house. Edward shook his head, marveling at the girl's unshakable courage. It's too risky. You're just a child. Sophia met his gaze with eyes that seemed much older than 8. Mr. Sterling, I've lived on the streets for 4 months. I've survived things that would make grown men cry. And besides, she took his hand with iron determination. Dad always said that when you find your family, you fight for them no matter what. Your family. You protected me all night. You shared your coffee with me. You treated me like I matter. Tears welled in Sophia's brown eyes. I haven't had a real family in a long time. I'm not going to abandon ours now. Edward felt something break and simultaneously rebuild inside his chest. For the first time in decades, someone had chosen to stand by him not for money or self-interest, but out of genuine loyalty. All right, he said finally, we'll get your father's documents, but we do it my way, very carefully. Sophia nodded vigorously. When? Edward looked up at the overcast sky, where the sun struggled to break through the heavy clouds. Tonight, when they all think we're hiding and afraid. The glass and steel tower of Sterling Enterprises stood against the night sky like a dark monolith. Edward watched the building that had been the center of his life for 3 decades, now seeing it through the eyes of an intruder. Security lights cast distorted shadows across the plaza, and surveillance cameras pivoted on their predictable arcs. Movements Edward knew by heart from years of watching them from his 40th floor window. Sophia remained crouched beside him, behind a dumpster, studying the patterns of the night guards with the intensity of a military strategist. The guard at the east entrance does a full round every 20 minutes, she whispered, and there's a 3-minute window when the back cameras don't cover the basement entrance. How do you know all this? Edward asked, impressed once again. By the girl's observational skills. Dad brought me here a few times when Mom was working late at the hospital. While he finished reports, I'd play a game of counting the patterns. She smiled sadly. He said it was important to always pay attention to what's going on around you. Edward felt a pang of remorse, picturing Robert Miller working unpaid overtime while caring for his young daughter, desperately trying to keep the job Edward would eventually take from him for reasons that now seemed petty and unjust. It's time, Sophia touched his arm. The guard just started his round. They moved like shadows along the side of the building, Sophia guiding Edward through a maze of air conditioning units and pipes he had never noticed in all his years of entering through the front door. The basement entrance was hidden behind a ventilation grate that Sophia manipulated with the familiarity of someone who had played there many times. The basement smelled of machine oil and mildew, an underworld that existed completely separate from the luxurious offices on the upper floors. Sophia navigated the narrow corridors with confidence, leading Edward deeper into the building's guts until they stopped before a wall that looked completely ordinary. Here, she said simply, pressing a specific section of the plaster. To Edward's astonishment, a part of the wall shifted, revealing a small, empty space behind it. How did your father find this? He helped with the building renovation years ago. He said he found this space by accident when a pipe burst. Sophia reached into the hole and pulled out a thick plastic envelope, sealed against moisture. Dad always kept important things like this. Edward took the envelope with trembling hands, feeling the weight of the documents inside. But before he could open it, a familiar voice echoed down the corridor. I really was hoping you'd be harder to find, brother. Edward turned slowly, his blood freezing in his veins. Emerging from the shadows of the hallway, flanked by 2 men in dark clothes, was Richard Sterling, his younger brother and the company's vice president. Richard, Edward could barely get the name out. "What are you doing here?" Richard smiled, but there was no warmth in his expression. "Same thing as you, I imagine, looking for documents that could cause unnecessary problems for our family." Sophia instinctively hid behind Edward, but her eyes remained alert, scanning for possible exits. Edward put a protective arm around her, his mind struggling to process his brother's presence in this impossible situation. "You shouldn't be here," Richard continued, his voice carrying a coldness Edward had never heard before. "You should have gone up to your room last night, like you always do. It would have been so much simpler for everyone." The truth hit Edward like a physical blow. You're behind the men at my house." "Behind them?" Richard laughed, a humorless sound. "Edward, I planned every detail. Your predictable habits, your inflexible routine, your arrogant certainty that you were safe behind all those cameras and alarms." He paused, looking at Sophia with curiosity. "Though I'll admit, I didn't plan for your little savior here." Edward held Sophia tighter, feeling her tremble against him. Not with fear, he realized, but with anger. "Why, Richard? Why would you do this?" "Because you ruined everything." Richard's cold mask finally slipped, revealing years of built-up resentment. Always the perfect son, always the chosen heir, always getting all the credit for the company's success. But I did the dirty work, Edward. I created the schemes that made us rich, and when employees like Robert Miller started asking questions, "You killed my dad." Sophia emerged from behind Edward, her small voice filled with a fury that made even the armed men flinch slightly. Richard looked at her with genuine surprise. "Killed? Who said anything about killing?" He laughed again. "Silly child, your father is very much alive. He's working on a farm upstate, completely oblivious to the fact that his precious little girl is playing detective in the city." Sophia faltered, confusion replacing her anger. "But he didn't come back. He promised he'd come back." "He will," Richard said almost gently, "as soon as I clean up this mess and make sure certain evidence disappears for good." Edward finally understood the full extent of the betrayal. "You were going to kill me and pin everything on me. The fraud, the irregularities, everything. Very clever, brother. Finally." Richard gestured to his two men. "Get the documents and take them upstairs. It's time to close this unpleasant chapter of our family history." But Sophia, small and seemingly helpless, did something no one expected. She screamed. Sophia's scream echoed through the basement corridors like a siren, high and piercing enough to wake anyone within a block. Richard snarled a curse, gesturing furiously at his men. "Shut that girl up!" But Sophia had already wrenched free from Edward's arm and darted, not to escape, but toward the main electrical panel on the nearby wall. Edward watched in shocked admiration as she pulled levers and slammed buttons with the precision of someone who had watched every detail of this place during her visits with her father. The basement lights died instantly, plunging them all into complete darkness. Emergency alarms began to blare throughout the building, and the security system's computerized voice announced, "Power failure detected. Evacuation protocols activated." "Brilliant," Edward muttered in the dark, feeling Sophia grab his hand and pull him in the opposite direction of Richard's men. "This way," she whispered, guiding him through the labyrinth of corridors she knew like the back of her hand. Behind them, Richard was shouting confused orders as his thugs stumbled over pipes and equipment. Sophia led Edward through a series of narrow passages he never knew existed, up service stairs, and finally emerged on the building's ground floor. The main lobby was bathed in flashing red emergency lights, and security guards were running in every direction, trying to determine the cause of the power failure. "The main exit," Edward pointed, but Sophia shook her head. "They'll see us. This way." She led him through a door marked "Authorized personnel only" that opened into the underground parking garage. The garage was nearly empty, save for a few cars from the night shift staff and the security vehicles. Sophia stopped behind a concrete pillar, panting. "We need a car," she said pragmatically. "Sophia, I can't steal a car." She looked at him with exasperation. "It's not stealing if it's to save our lives. And besides," she pointed to a familiar black BMW, "that's Mr. Marcus's car. He's probably upstairs helping your brother look for us." Edward hesitated only for a second before heading to the BMW. As luck would have it, Marcus always kept a spare key hidden in the wheel well, a habit Edward had always considered reckless, but which now proved providential. They got into the car just as the elevator doors opened and Richard emerged with his men, all holding powerful flashlights that swept across the garage. Edward started the engine and slammed his foot on the accelerator, the tires screeching on the concrete as the BMW shot toward the exit ramp. "There!" one of Richard's men yelled, but Edward had already sped up the ramp and out onto the street, the car bucking slightly as it transitioned from concrete to asphalt. Sophia clung to her seat as Edward drove with a skill he didn't know he possessed, navigating the empty pre-dawn streets with dangerous speed. In the rearview mirror, he could see the headlights of another vehicle following them. "They're coming," Sophia observed calmly, as if car chases were a normal part of her routine. Edward took a hard left, then another right, trying to use his knowledge of the downtown streets to lose them. But the car behind maintained a steady distance, its occupants clearly familiar with pursuit tactics. "Sophia," Edward said as he ran a red light, "I need you to tell me everything you know about where your father is. If Richard was telling the truth, your father might be our only hope of exposing this." "Dad gave me an address," she said, fumbling in the pockets of her dress. "A farm upstate. He said if anything happened, I should find him there." She produced a crumpled piece of paper with neat handwriting. Edward glanced at it. Clear Creek Farm, a rural route near the town of Clearwater, about 2 hours away. 2 hours, he muttered. "We have to lose these guys first." Edward made a sharp turn into a narrow alley he knew from his teenage years when he used to cut class to meet friends. The BMW barely fit between the brick walls, but managed to emerge on the other side. The larger SUV pursuing them was too wide to follow. "It worked!" Sophia clapped, but Edward remained focused. They had bought precious time, but Richard had resources and connections. It wouldn't take them long to reorganize the pursuit. "Sophia," he said, as he drove toward the highway leading out of the city, "you've saved my life twice in 2 days. Why? Why do you keep helping me?" She was silent for a long moment, watching the city lights shrink in the rearview window. "Because when Dad got fired, he cried. Just once, when he thought I wasn't looking. And he said you weren't a bad man, just a lost man who'd forgotten what really matters." Edward felt tears prick his eyes. "And you believe that?" "I believe. Dad was never wrong about people," Sophia answered simply. "And I believe that even lost people can find their way, if someone helps them remember who they really are." As they drove through the night toward a remote farm where they hoped to find the man who could save them both, Edward realized that Sophia wasn't just helping him survive, she was teaching him how to live again. The rural route snaked through, rolling pasture-covered hills, lit only by the BMW's headlights and a crescent moon that occasionally peeked through the clouds. Edward had been driving for nearly 2 hours, his eyes burning with fatigue, but he remained alert for any sign of pursuit. Sophia had fallen asleep in the passenger seat, her head resting against the window, the envelope with her father's documents clutched to her chest like a precious treasure. The GPS indicated they were close to their destination when Edward spotted a faded sign, "Clear Creek Farm, 1 mile." His heart sped up with a mix of hope and nervousness. If Robert Miller was truly here, if he was alive and safe, maybe they could finally begin to unravel the full extent of Richard's conspiracy. The farm appeared as a collection of yellow lights. In the middle of the rural darkness, a simple but well-kept wooden house with a wide porch and flower gardens that spoke of love and attention to detail. A few cows grazed in a nearby field, and chickens pecked freely in the dirt yard. Edward stopped the car near the front fence and gently touched Sophia's shoulder. "We're here." She woke instantly, as children accustomed to constant alertness do. Her eyes widened at the sight of the farm, and an expression of cautious hope spread across her face. "This is it. I recognize the description Dad gave me." Later, got out of the car and approached the front door. Edward could hear soft music playing inside, something classical and melancholic that perfectly suited the serene atmosphere. Sophia hesitated for a moment on the threshold, then took a deep breath and knocked. Footsteps approached from the other side, and the door opened to reveal a middle-aged man with graying hair and kind eyes. Edward recognized him immediately. Robert Miller, a little thinner than when he was at the company, but with a peaceful expression he had lacked during his final days as an employee. "Sophia." Robert froze for a moment as if seeing a ghost. Then his eyes filled with tears, and he pulled her into his arms in a desperate embrace. "My daughter, my little girl, how did you find me?" "Dad!" Sophia sobbed against his chest, her words coming out in broken gasps. "I thought you were dead. I thought I'd never see you again." Edward watched the reunion with a mix of joy and a sharp pain in his chest. This family had been torn apart by his unfeeling business decisions, and now he was witnessing the miracle of their reunion. Robert looked over Sophia's head, and his eyes met Edward's. "Mr. Sterling?" His voice was a mixture of surprise, confusion, and something that wasn't quite hostility, but certainly wasn't friendship. "Robert," Edward said softly, "I know you have every reason to hate me, but I need your help. We both do." Robert invited them in, still holding his daughter as if he feared she might disappear again. The house was simple but cozy, with rustic wooden furniture and photographs of Sophia scattered on every available surface. "How did you get here?" Robert asked after making tea for everyone. "And Sophia, where have you been all these months?" Sophia told the story of her life on the streets, of finding Edward at the mansion, and of the discovery that Richard was behind the entire conspiracy. Robert listened in growing silence, his expression darkening with each revelation. "I suspected Richard," he said finally. "When I found the irregularities, I tried to bring them to you first, Mr. Sterling, but he always intercepted my attempts. Said you were too busy, that he would handle it." "And the documents?" Edward motioned to the envelope Sophia still held. Robert smiled for the first time since they had arrived. "Oh, those are just copies. The real evidence." He stood and went to a bookshelf, removing several books to reveal a small safe built into the wall. "Is here. Years of fraudulent transactions, ghost accounts, forged contracts, all with Richard's signature." Edward leafed through the documents with growing horror and admiration for Robert's meticulousness. There was enough evidence not only to incriminate Richard, but also to trace a network of corruption that extended to other companies and public officials. "Why didn't you take this straight to the police?" Edward asked. Robert looked at Sophia, who had snuggled up beside him on the couch. "Because he threatened to hurt my family if I talked. He said he had connections everywhere, that he could make my daughter disappear without a trace." "Is that why you came here?" "A friend offered me work on this farm. I thought if I stayed away and kept quiet, you two would be safe." He kissed the top of Sophia's head. "But my brave little girl decided to save the man I thought was our enemy." Edward felt smaller than ever. "Robert, I'm so sorry." For everything. For the wrongful termination, for not listening to you, for causing your family so much suffering. Robert studied his face for a long moment. Do you know what hurt the most, Mr. Sterling? It wasn't losing my job. It was realizing that the man I respected had become someone who could no longer see the human being behind the numbers. But Dad, Sophia interrupted gently, he's changed. I saw it. He protected me. He shared his food with me. He treated me like I was important. Robert looked from his daughter to Edward, and something in his expression softened. Then maybe there's hope for all of us. The moment was shattered by the distant sound of engines approaching on the rural road. Richard had found them. Robert reacted with surprising speed to the sound of the approaching engines. Kill the lights, he whispered urgently, moving through the house with the efficiency of someone who had planned for this contingency. Sophia, get the documents. Edward, help me with this. They worked in silence, turning off lamps and closing curtains until the farmhouse was plunged into darkness. Through a crack in the front window, Edward could see 3 vehicles approaching slowly down the dirt road, their headlights sweeping the property like predatory eyes. Is there a back way out? Edward asked in a low voice. Robert shook his head. The farm backs up against a steep cliff. The only way out is the front. He took an old shotgun from a kitchen cabinet, checking to see if it was loaded. But I know every inch of this property in the dark. They don't. The cars stopped in the front yard, and Edward recognized Richard's silhouette emerging from the lead vehicle. Even in the darkness, his brother's arrogant posture was unmistakable. 2 other men got out of each of the other cars, making a total of 7, all clearly armed and ready for a confrontation. Edward! Richard's voice echoed through the silent night. I know you're in there. Let's handle this civilly. Just come out with the documents and no one gets hurt. Robert positioned himself near a side window, his shotgun aimed outside. Edward marveled at the transformation of the timid, meticulous accountant into the fierce protector of his family. There's a root cellar, Robert whispered. It leads to a tunnel that comes out near the barn. It was part of the Underground Railroad, used to hide runaway slaves. We're not leaving you alone, Sophia said firmly, clutching her father's hand. My brave girl, Robert smiled in the darkness. This time you have to let Dad take care of you. Get Mr. Sterling and the documents to safety. I'll create a diversion. Robert. No, Edward intervened. I've caused your family enough suffering. I won't let you. Risk yourself for me. It's not for you, Robert replied calmly. It's for her. He gestured toward Sophia. My daughter believes you can be a better person. If she's right, then that's something worth fighting for. Outside, Richard was losing his patience. All right, brother, if you want to do this the hard way, he gestured to his men, who began to fan out around the house. Robert led Edward and Sophia to the cellar down a narrow, creaking staircase. The smell of damp earth and old wood filled the subterranean air. At the far end of the cellar, behind shelves filled with home-canned goods, Robert removed a few loose floorboards, revealing the entrance to a dark tunnel. Follow this for about 50 yards. The tunnel curves to the right, then slopes up to an exit near the barn. He hugged Sophia tightly. Take care of each other. Dad, come with us, Sophia pleaded, tears streaming down her cheeks. Someone has to buy you time to get to the barn, and someone has to make your brother pay for what he's done. Robert looked directly at Edward. Protect my daughter. Promise me. I promise, Edward said solemnly, with my life. They entered the tunnel, just as the sound of shattering glass echoed from the house above. Richard's men had begun their assault. The tunnel was cramped and dark, forcing them to move hunched over, feeling their way along the earthen walls. Behind them, Edward could hear shouts and the sound of furniture being overturned. Then the blast of a shotgun, followed by furious curses. Robert was keeping his promise to distract them. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever in the blackness. But finally, Edward felt a draft of cool air, signaling they were approaching the exit. They emerged behind the barn, the rural night enveloping them with its smells of hay and livestock. "Dad's truck," Sophia pointed to a small pickup parked near the barn. "He always leaves the key under the seat." Edward found the keys quickly, but hesitated before starting the engine. "Sophia, I can't just leave your father back there. If we go back now, his sacrifice will be for nothing," she answered with a wisdom that broke Edward's heart. "Dad wants us to be safe. That's how we can honor him." Edward started the engine just as more shots echoed from the house. This time, they weren't just from Robert's shotgun. He floored the accelerator, driving without headlights down the back road Robert had mentioned, guiding them only by the light of the moon. In the rearview mirror, Edward could see the lights of the farm, shrinking in the distance. Somewhere in that darkness, a good man was facing overwhelming odds to protect the daughter he had only just found again. "He'll be okay," Sophia said quietly, more to herself than to Edward. "Dad's smarter than they think." Edward prayed silently that she was right, knowing it was now just the two of them against the world again. But this time, they had enough evidence to destroy Richard forever, if they could survive long enough to use it. Edward drove down the dark country road for nearly an hour before pulling into an abandoned gas station on the edge of the highway. His hands were shaking on the steering wheel, not just from exhaustion, but from a toxic mix of adrenaline, guilt, and fear for Robert's fate. Sophia sat silently beside him, clutching the documents to her chest, her eyes fixed on the direction from which they had come. "I need to try calling the police," Edward said finally, pointing to a rusty payphone near the boarded-up station. "What if the police are involved too?" Sophia asked with the justified paranoia of someone who had learned that adults in positions of authority weren't always trustworthy. Richard said he had connections everywhere. Edward paused, considering her words. In the past few days, he had discovered that people he had trusted for years, Marcus, his own brother, were his enemies. How many others were part of the conspiracy? "So, what do you suggest?" Sophia bit her lip, thinking hard. "The reporter. The one who always asked you the tough questions at press conferences. What was her name?" "Carla Vance," Edward remembered. "From investigative TV. Dad always said she was one of the only honest journalists in the city, that she couldn't be bought or intimidated." Sophia looked at Edward with determination. "If she saw this evidence?" Edward nodded slowly. Carla Vance had a reputation for being incorruptible, known for exposing corporate scandals regardless of how powerful the players were. If anyone could get the evidence against Richard out to the public, it was her. But how to contact her safely? Edward remembered that Carla often worked late at the investigative TV studios. It was nearly 4 in the morning. She might be there prepping the morning news. He dialed the station's number from the payphone, using a few of the quarters Sophia had saved. "Investigative TV, night." "Desk," a sleepy voice answered. "I need to speak with Carla Vance. It's an emergency." "She's here, but she doesn't take calls from strangers. Who's calling?" Edward hesitated. Giving his real name could alert the wrong people to his location. "Tell her it's about the accounting irregularities at Sterling Enterprises. She'll want to take the call." A few minutes later, Carla's familiar, sharp voice came on the line. "Who is this, and how do you know about an investigation I'm conducting?" "Carla, it's Edward Sterling. I know this might sound unbelievable, but I need your help. I have proof of a conspiracy that goes far beyond what you imagine." There was a long pause. "Edward Sterling is wanted by the police for corporate fraud. if you're really him. Exactly, and those charges were fabricated by my brother Richard to cover up his own crimes. Edward took a deep breath. Carla, you've known me for years. You may not like my business methods, but you know I'm not a criminal. Another pause. Where are you? Edward looked around the abandoned gas station. Somewhere safe, but not for long. Richard has resources and connections. If you want the story of the century, you need to come to me. Carla gave him an address, a 24-hour diner downtown that she knew well. 1 hour, come alone. I can't come alone. I have a child with me. A crucial witness. A child? Carla's voice sharpened. The daughter of Robert Miller, a former employee, who discovered the fraud. She saved me from an assassination attempt. Edward heard Carla take a sharp breath on the other end of the line. All right, 1 hour. And Edward, if this is a trap, I have armed people backing me up. They drove back toward the city on secondary roads, Edward constantly checking the rear-view mirror for followers. Sophia methodically organized her father's documents, separating the most critical evidence and explaining to Edward the meaning of each fraudulent transaction. Dad spent months documenting all of this, she said, with pride. Every number, every date, every forged signature. He used to say the truth always leaves a trail, even when people try to hide it. The central diner, the same place where Edward had met with Marcus, was nearly empty when they arrived. Carla. Vance was waiting for them at a back booth, a middle-aged woman with salt and pepper hair and piercing eyes that missed little. She stood as they entered, her gaze immediately landing on Sophia. You must be Sophia Miller, she said gently. I've heard a lot about you. Sophia nodded shyly, but stayed close to Edward. Let's see this evidence, Carla said, getting straight to the point. Edward and Sophia spent the next hour laying out every document, every transaction, every piece of the corrupt web Richard had woven over the years. Carla asked precise questions, took detailed notes, and photographed the most important documents. This is explosive, she murmured finally. If half of this is true, it will destroy not only your brother, but several other prominent figures in this city. It's all true, Sophia said firmly. Dad never lied about numbers. Carla smiled at the girl, then looked seriously at Edward. You realize this also exposes your own negligence as CEO. You may not have committed the crimes, but you allowed them to happen under your watch. Edward nodded. I'm prepared to face the consequences of my failures, but Richard needs to be stopped before he hurts anyone else. Carla was starting to reply when her phone rang. She answered, her expression growing more and more concerned as she listened. Edward, she said when she hung up, we have a problem. The police just found Robert Miller's body at the farm. Sophia let out a choked cry, as if she'd been punched in the gut. But the official story, Carla continued quickly, is that he was killed by you during a kidnapping attempt. Sophia collapsed into the booth, her small face twisted with a grief no child should ever have to bear. Edward pulled her into his arms, feeling her tremble against his chest as silent tears streamed down her cheeks. His own heart shattered as he realized the brave girl who had saved his life was now an orphan because of his own past business choices. I'm so sorry. Sophia, he murmured, his own tears mingling with her matted hair. Your father died because of me. I'll never forgive myself. No, Sophia lifted her head, her red-rimmed eyes shining with an iron resolve that stunned both Edward and Carla. Dad didn't die because of you. He died because he chose to protect the truth, and now we have to honor that choice. Carla watched the interaction with an expression that was both moved and professional. Sophia's right, but you're both in mortal danger. The police have been given shoot-to-kill orders if Edward resists arrest. Edward felt his stomach drop. Richard really thought of everything, didn't he? Apparently. But there's one thing he didn't count on. Carla smiled grimly. That I've been investigating irregularities at your company for months. This evidence you've brought me confirms suspicions I already had, but couldn't prove. What does that mean? Sophia asked, wiping her eyes on the sleeve of her dress. It means we can turn the tables on Richard, but it will be dangerous, and it will require you to trust me completely. Edward studied the journalist's face. Carla Vance had been his intellectual adversary for years, always asking the hard questions, always pushing for transparency. But her integrity was unshakable. If anyone could help them, it was her. What do you have in mind? A live, on-air confrontation. Richard thinks he's controlled the narrative, but if we can get him in a situation where he has to answer to the evidence publicly, with cameras broadcasting to the entire city, he'll never agree, Edward interrupted. He will if he thinks. He's going to manipulate me into broadcasting his version of events. I'll call him, tell him I want an exclusive interview about the heinous crimes his brother committed. He won't be able to resist the opportunity to publicly cement his victory. Sophia sat up straighter in the booth. And when he gets to the studio, we'll be there with the evidence? Exactly. But Sophia, you'll have to be brave one more time. You'll need to tell everyone on television what you saw, what your father discovered. It will be hard. Dad always said the truth has to be spoken, even when it hurts. Sophia gripped Edward's hand. I'm ready. Edward looked at the extraordinary girl who had become his daughter in all but name. In 3 days, she had lost everything. Home, security, her father, but she still found the courage to fight for justice. Sophia, you don't have to do this. You've been through enough. I'm not just doing this for Dad, she replied simply. I'm doing it for our family. 2 hours later, Edward and Sophia were hidden backstage at the investigative TV studio, watching. On a monitor as Richard arrived for the interview, his brother looked confident, almost exultant, clearly believing he was about to publicly seal Edward's destruction. Good evening, Richard Sterling, Carla began as the cameras went live. Thank you for agreeing to give us this exclusive interview about the terrible crimes your brother Edward committed. It's my duty as a citizen to clarify the truth about a man who betrayed everyone's trust, Richard replied with false solemnity. Edward was always unstable, but I never imagined he would stoop to corporate fraud and murder. Speaking of evidence, Carla smiled coldly. I have some I'd like to show our viewers. Richard's expression shifted slightly as Carla began displaying documents on the screen, the same evidence Robert Miller had meticulously collected. These are transactions showing years of systematic fraud at Sterling Enterprises. Curious how all of them bear your signature, Richard, not Edward's. Those are obvious forgeries, Richard stammered, his confidence evaporating. Are they forgeries? A small but clear voice echoed through the studio. Sophia emerged from the wings, walking directly toward the cameras with a courage that made Edward's chest swell with pride. Because my dad copied them directly from the company files before he was fired for trying to expose the truth. Richard's face went white as he saw Sophia. You're supposed to be dead? Like my father? Sophia interrupted, her voice rising in volume and conviction. You sent your men to kill a good man because he discovered your crimes. And now you want to blame Edward Sterling for what you did. This is a farce. Richard shot up from his chair, only to realize the studio's security guards were blocking the exits. You can't prove anything. Edward finally stepped out from backstage, walking slowly until he stood beside Sophia. Hello, brother. I have proof of 3 decades of crimes you've committed, and this time The whole city is watching. Richard looked around desperately, realizing he had walked into a perfect trap. The cameras captured every bead of sweat on his forehead, every tremor in his hands. "This is your chance to confess," Carla said calmly, "or we can continue presenting evidence until there's no doubt in anyone's mind who the real criminal is." "Here." Richard looked at Edward, then at Sophia, finally understanding that he had lost. And for the first time in his life, the truth was about to win. The silence in the studio was deafening. Richard remained standing, his hands trembling slightly as he stared into the cameras broadcasting his humiliation across the city. Edward could see the exact moment the reality of the situation crashed down on his brother. There was no escape, no convincing lie, no amount of power left to cover up decades of crime. Richard began, his voice cracking. "I did what was necessary to protect our company." "Protect?" Sophia stepped forward, her small voice sharp and piercing. "You killed my father. A good man who only wanted to do the right thing." Tears began to stream down Richard's face. Not of remorse, Edward realized, but of self-pity and desperation. "You don't understand the pressure, the risks, the sacrifices I had to make." "The sacrifices you made?" Edward finally found his voice, years of betrayal and pain, hardening into controlled fury. "Robert Miller sacrificed his career for honesty. Sophia sacrificed her childhood to save a stranger. You sacrificed only your humanity for greed." Carla kept the cameras focused on the group, allowing thousands of viewers to witness the complete unraveling of one of the city's most powerful men. "Richard Sterling, do you confess to ordering the murder of Robert Miller?" Richard looked around the studio like a cornered animal. Edward almost felt a flicker of pity, almost. But then he remembered Sophia sleeping in an abandoned warehouse, Robert risking everything to protect his daughter, and all the families who had suffered because of his brother's schemes. "I had no choice," Richard finally mumbled. "Robert wouldn't take money to stay quiet. He threatened to expose everything if we didn't stop the fraud." "So you had him killed to protect your crimes?" Carla pressed. Yes." The confession came out as a defeated whisper. "But Edward knew. He always knew I cut corners, that I found creative ways to boost profits." Edward shook his head slowly. "I suspected you were aggressive in your business dealings, Richard. I never imagined you were a criminal. That's the difference you could never understand." At that moment, police officers entered the studio. Not the local cops on Richard's payroll, but federal agents Carla had contacted while setting up the interview. Richard didn't resist as they put him in handcuffs, his arrogance finally replaced by absolute resignation. "Edward Sterling," the lead agent addressed him, "you'll still have to answer for corporate negligence, but the charges of fraud and murder have been dropped based on the evidence presented tonight." Edward nodded, pulling Sophia into a tight embrace as she ran to him the moment Richard was led away. "I'm prepared to face the consequences of my failures." 3 weeks later, Edward was in his office, no longer the lavish 40th floor suite, but a smaller, more modest space where he had established a foundation dedicated to helping families harmed by irresponsible corporate practices. The walls were decorated with drawings Sophia had made, and a photo of her and Robert held a place of honor on his desk. "Mr. Edward," Sophia ran in, her pink backpack bouncing, "my teacher said my project on honesty was the best in the class." Edward smiled, opening his arms to receive her. In the past few days, they had finalized the adoption papers, making official what already existed in their hearts. Sophia Miller Sterling was officially his daughter, and he was officially responsible for raising the bravest child he had ever known. "I'm so proud of you," he said, kissing the top of her head. "Your father would be proud too." Sophia nestled into his arms, but Edward noticed she no longer cried when they mentioned Robert. The pain was still there, it always would be, but it had been tempered by a deep understanding that her father's love lived on through everything she had learned from him. "You know what Dad told me once?" she asked softly. "What?" "That the most important people in our lives aren't the ones who make us feel safe, but the ones who make us want to be brave." She looked up into Edward's eyes. "You made me want to be brave. And Dad made you want to be good." Edward felt tears prick his eyes. "And you taught me that family isn't just about blood, it's about choosing to take care of each other no matter what." They sat in silence for a moment, watching through the window as children played in the park across the street. Edward had lost a corporate empire, but he had gained something infinitely more valuable, a real family and the chance to be the man Robert Miller had always believed he could be. "Can I ask you something?" Sophia said finally. "Anything." "Do you miss the big mansion?" Edward looked around his simple office, then at the extraordinary daughter who had chosen to love him in spite of everything. "I never really had a home until now," he answered honestly, and he truly never had. 1 year had passed since the stormy night that changed 2 lives forever. Edward stood in the yard of his new house, a cozy home in a family neighborhood, a world away from the cold, isolated mansion he had inhabited. For decades, the sound of children's laughter filled the air as Sophia played with friends, a sight that warmed his heart in ways corporate profits never could. "Daddy Edward!" Sophia ran to him, her hair flying in the wind, carrying a bouquet of wildflowers she had picked. "These are for Daddy Robert's grave." Every Saturday they visited the cemetery where Robert Miller had been laid to rest with the honors befitting a hero. Edward had insisted on a beautiful memorial that described Robert as a man of unshakable integrity who gave his life for the truth. Sophia always brought fresh flowers and told her father about her week. As they walked to the car, Edward reflected on the extraordinary changes the past year had brought. The foundation he'd created had already helped over 200 families harmed by corporate malfeasance. Ironically, doing good proved more fulfilling than any business deal he had ever closed. Sophia had blossomed in ways that constantly amazed him. Her natural intelligence, combined with the stability of a loving home and a proper education, had turned her into a brilliant student and a confident child. But she never lost the extraordinary compassion that had led her to save a stranger on that first night. "You know," Sophia said, as Edward drove toward the cemetery, "my teacher asked us to write about our heroes for an essay." "And who are you going to write about?" Sophia smiled, swinging her legs from the back seat. "About Daddy Robert, of course, but also about you." Edward felt a lump form in his throat. "I'm no hero, Sophia. I made too many mistakes." "That's what makes you a real hero," she replied, with the simple wisdom that always left him speechless. "Real heroes are people who do wrong things, but then work really hard to fix them." At the cemetery, they knelt before Robert's headstone, Sophia carefully arranging the flowers while she chattered away about her grades, her new friends, and how Edward was teaching her to ride a bike. Edward stood in respectful silence, offering his own silent prayers of gratitude to the man who had sacrificed everything. "Daddy Robert," Sophia concluded her weekly talk, "thank you for teaching me that good people exist, even when the world seems scary, and thank you for giving me the courage to save Daddy Edward that night in the rain." On the way home, Edward thought about the extraordinary chain of events that had brought a brave child to his mansion's hallway at that exact moment. If she had been 5 minutes later, if she had chosen not to get involved, if she had run instead of warning him, so many what-ifs that could have resulted in tragedy instead of redemption. "Sophia," he said as they pulled into the driveway, "can I tell you a secret?" "Of course." "That first night, when you warned me not to go up the stairs, do you know what impressed me the most?" What? "It wasn't just your courage. It was the fact that you, a complete stranger who had every reason to hate me, looked at me and didn't see a monster. You saw someone who needed saving." Sophia tilted her head, considering this. "Maybe I just knew deep down that you needed a family as much as I did." That night, after Sophia had gone to bed, Edward sat in his favorite armchair, not an expensive Italian piece, but a comfortable rocking chair he'd found at a thrift store, and reflected on the extraordinary journey his life had taken. He had lost a brother to greed and betrayal. He had lost a company built over decades. He had lost a fortune it had taken a lifetime to amass. But he had gained something infinitely more precious, a daughter who loved him, not for what he had, but for who he had chosen to become. The staircase of his new home creaked softly as Sophia padded down from her room, clutching her favorite teddy bear. "I forgot to say goodnight," she said, climbing into his lap. Edward hugged her, breathing in the scent of baby shampoo and innocence. "Good night, my brave girl." "Good night, Daddy Edward. Thanks for teaching me that real families choose each other." As he carried Sophia back to her room, Edward glanced at the staircase leading to the second floor of his new home. There was nothing threatening about it, nothing sinister or dangerous. It was just an ordinary staircase leading to rooms filled with love and happy memories in the making. But he would never forget the other staircase, the one that had nearly led to his death, but had instead led him to his real life. Sometimes, he mused, our darkest moments are actually doorways to our greatest light. Edward tucked Sophia into her bed, kissed her forehead, and whispered, "Sweet dreams, my love." And for the first time in decades, Edward Sterling went to sleep, knowing with absolute certainty that he was truly loved, truly home, and truly blessed. The brave girl in the shadows hadn't just saved his life. She had saved his soul.